You would never have guessed that a modern, bold, and outspoken woke waitress would insult Clint Eastwood in the midst of a bustling restaurant, unaware that the iconic star was not only there, but also the owner, an incident that sparked an incredible twist and left everyone speechless. The house was burning, and Clint Eastwood knew he had exactly 6 minutes to decide which ghosts to save. Flames licked up the Victorian's weathered siding as he stood paralyzed on the front lawn, his breath forming small clouds in the October air. Behind him, neighbors gathered in hushed clusters, their faces illuminated by the orange glow. Someone had called 911, but the volunteer fire department in Carmel-by-the-Sea, California, was still 8 minutes away. Inside the house, his grandmother's house, now his, were 46 boxes of memories, photographs, letters, diaries dating back to 1937, the collected evidence of 5 generations of Eastwood family members, each haunted in their own way. "I can't go in there," said a voice beside him. The young garçon, his next-door neighbor, grabbed his arm as he took a step forward. "Clint, it's not safe." But Clint barely heard him. His eyes were fixed on the second-floor window, where smoke billowed from his grandmother's study. If he didn't go now, everything would be lost. Not just papers and photographs, but the truth he'd spent the last 3 months piecing together. The diary was in there, the one that explained everything. "Let me go," he said, yanking free from the young man's grip. "I know what I'm doing." That was a lie. He had no idea what he was doing, only that he couldn't stand here and watch it all burn. Not after what he'd discovered last night. Not after finally understanding why his mother had left, why his grandmother had kept so many secrets. He pulled his polo shirt over his nose and mouth and ran toward the house, ignoring the shouts behind him. The heat hit him like a wall as he reached the porch, the air shimmering and thick. The front door was still intact, and he pushed it, open with his shoulder, ducking low as a plume of smoke escaped. Inside, the familiar hallway had become an alien landscape. The wallpaper his grandmother had chosen 50 years ago was bubbling and peeling, family photographs curled in their frames. Clint dropped to his knees, crawling toward the stairs as his eyes stung and watered. 6 minutes, maybe less now. As he began to climb, he heard a crack above him, the terrible sound of something structural giving way. The staircase shuddered beneath his hands and knees. Then came a crash from the second floor, and Clint knew, with sudden devastating clarity, that he wasn't going to make it to the study. The diary, the truth, was beyond his reach. But there was still the living room, still the metal box hidden behind the false panel in the fireplace, the one his grandmother had shown him when he was 12. "For emergencies," Eleanor had said, never explaining what kind of emergency would require old photographs and a stack of letters tied with faded ribbon. Clint changed direction, crawling across the superheated floorboards toward the living room. The air was getting thinner, harder to breathe. His lungs burned with each shallow gasp. But he kept moving, propelled by a determination that surprised him. The same determination that had kept him searching through his grandmother's papers long after everyone told him to let the past stay buried. The living room was still relatively untouched by the flames, though smoke hung in a thick layer near the ceiling. Clint reached the fireplace and fumbled for the hidden latch, his fingers clumsy with fear and adrenaline. The panel slid open, revealing the metal box just as he remembered. As he clutched it to his chest, preparing to make his escape, his gaze fell on the portrait above the mantel, his grandmother at 30, holding Clint's mother as a baby. Their expressions serious, as if they already knew what was coming. Clint hesitated, looking up at their faces. Then he made a decision. Reaching up, he lifted the heavy frame from the wall and tucked it under his arm alongside the metal box. It was awkward, unwieldy, but he couldn't leave them behind. Not again. The smoke was thickening, descending. Clint dropped back to his knees, crawling toward the hallway, toward the door. His lungs screamed for clean air. The metal box dug into his ribs. The picture frame caught on something, and he heard the glass crack, but he kept going. Just a few more feet, just a few more seconds. Behind him, the ceiling in the living room collapsed with a sound like the end of the world. 3 months earlier, Clint had arrived in Carmel-by-the-Sea with nothing but a small suitcase and the remnants of a life he was trying to leave behind. At 54, he was starting over, Again. The divorce had been finalized in June. The job he'd loved at the restaurant he managed had become a casualty of the latest. A round of hospitality industry layoffs in July, and then in August the call had come about his grandmother. "She's gone," his Aunt Patricia had said, her voice oddly flat over the phone, peacefully in her sleep. Clint had stood in his half-empty apartment, surrounded by moving boxes, and felt nothing at first. He and Eleanor hadn't spoken in nearly a decade, not since the Christmas when Clint had finally asked about his mother, and Eleanor had refused, once again, to give him answers. "I'm sorry," Clint had said automatically. "There's more," Patricia continued. "She left you the restaurant." That had been unexpected. Clint had assumed the elegant establishment would go to Patricia, who had remained in Carmel by the Sea her whole life, who had been the dutiful daughter, while Clint's mother, Rebecca, had fled at 18, returning only once to leave behind her own 4-year-old son before disappearing again. "Why me?" Clint had asked. "I have no idea," Patricia replied, a trace of bitterness in her voice. "But there are conditions. You have to live here for at least 6 months before you can sell, and you have to manage the restaurant yourself. No one else is allowed to help." It had seemed like Eleanor's final punishment, forcing Clint to confront the ghosts he'd spent his adult life running from. But with no job, no wife, and a rapidly dwindling bank account, Clint had no choice but to accept. The restaurant had been exactly as he remembered it, imposing, beautiful, suffocating. It sat on a hill overlooking the town, its elegant facade and wraparound terrace giving it the appearance of a ship about to set sail. Inside, time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the 1970s. The same heavy drapes, the same antique furniture, even the same faint smell of fine wine and polished wood. Eleanor had been a keeper of things. Every office drawer, every cabinet was filled with carefully preserved artifacts of a family history that no one talked about. Clint had started in the kitchen, sorting through decades of accumulated recipe books and utensils, telling himself he was easing into the task. But on the third day, he'd found the first diary, tucked behind a stack of cookbooks. It had belonged to his great-grandmother, Iris, and contained mostly mundane accounts of daily life in Carmel during the Depression. Still, Clint had found himself captivated by the glimpses of the woman behind the faded photograph that hung in the upstairs office. More diaries followed, scattered throughout the restaurant, as if Eleanor had been hiding them. From whom, Clint couldn't guess. He began organizing them chronologically, creating a timeline that spanned from 1937 to 1985. But there were gaps, significant gaps, especially around the years when Rebecca would have been a teenager. And then there was the silence about Clint's father. No one had ever told him his name. When he'd asked as a child, Eleanor had simply said, "He's not important," in a tone that discouraged further questions. The weeks had passed in a blur of dust and discovery. Clint found himself talking to the E.E. restaurant, to the diaries, to the ghosts of people he had never really known. Sometimes he imagined they answered back. The young garçon had been the first person in Carmel by the Sea to show him genuine kindness. A recent immigrant who had moved to town 2 years earlier, he worked at the restaurant and seemed to understand Clint's need for both solitude and occasional human contact. "My grandmother had a system," he told Clint one evening as they sat on the terrace, drinking wine and watching the sunset. "When I had to send money back home, she taught me how to organize everything by importance." Clint had laughed. Eleanor was more of a chaos theorist. "I found her birth certificate in a box of wine receipts." Their friendship had developed easily, without the complications Clint had come to expect from relationships. The young garçon didn't push when Clint deflected questions about his past. He brought over homemade meals from his country and helped Clint replace the broken patio step without being asked. Most importantly, he didn't seem to care that he was Eleanor's grandson or Rebecca's son, labels that followed him through town like persistent shadows. It was the garçon who had suggested that the gaps in the diaries might be deliberate, that Eleanor might have removed certain volumes before her death. "People hide what they fear," he'd said. "They decide what story they want the world to know." His words had sparked something in Clint, an instinct for the buried truth, the story behind the story. He had begun searching more systematically, looking for hidden compartments, false bottoms in drawers, anything that might reveal what Eleanor had wanted to conceal. And then, the night before the fire, he had found it. The missing diary from 1979, the year Rebecca turned 18, the year before Clint was born. It had been hidden inside a hollowed-out copy of a classic novel in the study, and Clint had stayed up all night reading it, his heart pounding as Eleanor's elegant handwriting revealed the secret that had fractured their family. The truth about Clint's father, about why Rebecca had left, about the choice Eleanor had forced her daughter to make. By dawn, Clint had understood everything, and nothing. He had fallen into a troubled sleep at his grandmother's desk, the diary open beneath his cheek, his dreams filled with fire and loss and a terrible, clarifying rage. He hadn't known that within hours, those dreams would become reality. That a faulty wire in the attic, stressed by the first cold snap of autumn, would spark and smolder and finally ignite, setting in motion the events that would force him to decide which ghosts deserved salvation. The smoke inhalation had left his voice raspy, his throat raw. For 3 days after the fire, Clint had barely spoken, communicating through notes scribbled on the legal pad the gerente had brought to the hospital. But the silence had given him time to think, to plan, to decide what came next. Now, standing in the charred skeleton of what had once been his grandmother's restaurant, his restaurant, Clint felt an unexpected sense of liberation. The structure itself was beyond saving. The fire chief had made that clear during his brief, sympathetic visit to his hospital room, but the foundation was intact, and so was the land beneath it. "You could rebuild," the woke Garçonnette said, picking her way carefully across the debris-strewn yard to stand beside him. Her earlier hostility had softened after the fire, replaced by a tentative respect. "If you wanted to." Clint shook his head. "I don't think I do." The metal box had survived, though the heat had warped its lid, making it difficult to open. Inside, he had found what Eleanor had considered worth saving: a stack of letters from Clint's grandfather, written during his military service. Photographs of Iris and Eleanor as young women, a small jewelry box containing a pearl necklace and a silver locket, and a folded document that turned out to be Rebecca's original birth certificate, with the father's name listed clearly in black ink. The portrait had fared less well. The frame was scorched, the glass shattered, but the image remained mostly intact. Eleanor and Rebecca, their expressions serious, their eyes holding secrets that now seemed painfully obvious to Clint. What hadn't survived was the diary from 1979. It had been on the desk in the study when the ceiling collapsed, consumed by flames before Clint could reach it. The truth it contained, the full story of Rebecca's pregnancy, of Eleanor's ultimatum, of the man whose name Clint now knew but whose face remained a mystery, was lost forever. Or so he had thought. "Clint, there's something I need to tell. You." The gerente's voice pulled him from his thoughts. He was holding a manila envelope, looking uncharacteristically nervous. "I found this in the mail the day after the fire. No stamp, no return address." Clint took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note in an unfamiliar script. "Eleanor gave this to me for safekeeping years ago, with instructions to pass it on after her death. I'm sorry for the delay. She wanted you to have this, regardless of what happened to the restaurant. Margaret Wilson." "Who's Margaret Wilson?" the garçon asked, peering over his shoulder. "I have no idea," Clint replied, turning the note over as if it might contain more information. "But apparently, she knew my grandmother." The name wasn't in any of the diaries Clint had read, wasn't mentioned in family stories. Another ghost, another mystery. That evening in the gerente's living room, Clint plugged the USB drive into his laptop. It contained a single video file, dated June 15, 2013, 3 months before Eleanor's death. With the young garçon sitting beside him on the couch, a silent, supportive presence, Clint clicked play. His grandmother's face filled the screen. Eleanor was thinner than Clint remembered, her once dark hair now completely silver, But her eyes were as sharp and clear as ever. "Clint," Eleanor began, her voice steady, "if you're watching this, it means I'm gone, and you've inherited the restaurant. It also means you've started asking questions, the same questions you've been asking since you were a child, about your mother, about your father, about why our family fractured the way it did." Clint felt his breath catch. On screen, Eleanor paused, seeming to gather herself. "I've spent decades protecting a secret that was never mine to keep. Out of pride, out of shame, out of a misguided sense of what was right for this family, for you. But you deserve the truth, even if it changes how you think of me." For the next 45 minutes, Eleanor spoke without interruption, laying bare the history that the diaries had only hinted at. How Clint's father, David Mercer, had been Patricia's fiancé before he fell in love with Rebecca. How Eleanor, furious at what she saw as her younger daughter's betrayal, had forced Rebecca to choose. Give up the baby for adoption, or leave Carmel and never return. How Rebecca had fled to San Francisco 8 months pregnant, only to realize after Clint's birth that she couldn't be the mother her son deserved. "She brought you back to me when you were 4, Eleanor said, her composure finally cracking. She stood in the foyer and said, "I can't do this anymore. He needs stability. He needs a home." And then she left. I told everyone she'd abandoned you, that she was selfish and irresponsible. But the truth is, Clint, I gave her an impossible choice, and then I gave you a life built on lies. Tears streamed down Clint's face as he watched his grandmother's confession. Beside him, the garçon quietly passed him a box of tissues. "David never knew about you," Eleanor continued. "Rebecca made me promise not to tell him. He and Patricia were married by then, with children of their own. She didn't want to destroy another family." Clint paused the video, his mind racing. "Patricia's husband," he whispered. "My father is my aunt's husband. My cousins are my half-siblings." "Do you think Patricia knows?" the garçon asked gently. "I have no idea." Clint's hands were shaking too badly to press play again. "All these years I've been so angry at my mother for leaving, but she was just trying to protect me from this mess, from Eleanor's manipulation." The garçon took his hand, his fingers warm and steady against Clint's cold ones. "Do you want to keep watching?" Clint nodded, reaching for the laptop. Eleanor's final words were an apology, not just to Clint, but to Rebecca and David as well. And then a request. "Find your mother, Clint. She lives in San Francisco now. She's never stopped thinking about you. I've included her address in the envelope with this USB drive. It's time for both of you to stop carrying the weight of my mistakes." But there had been no envelope with the USB drive. No address. Just another dead end in a lifetime of them. As the video ended, Clint closed the laptop and leaned back against the couch, emotionally exhausted. "So now what?" he asked, not really expecting an answer. The gerente hesitated, then said, "I might know someone who can help. A former colleague of mine works at the San Francisco Records office. If your mother still lives there, we can find her." Clint looked at him, really looked at him for the first time since the fire. His kind eyes. The way he waited for Clint to decide, never pushing. In the chaos of the past 3 months, this man had become the one fixed point he could rely on. "Why? Are you doing all this for me?" he asked. "Because," the gerente said simply, "everyone deserves to know their own story." 2 days later, they drove to San Francisco in the gerente's aging car. The address his former colleague had found was for an apartment above a bookstore in the North Beach district. As they parked across the street, Clint felt a familiar panic rising in his chest, the same panic he'd felt as a child whenever he imagined this moment. "I can't do this," he said, his hand frozen on the door handle. "You can," the gerente replied, "but you don't have to. Not today. Not ever, if you're not ready." He turned to look at him, at the gentle understanding in his expression, and felt something shift inside him. The weight he'd been carrying, the weight of abandonment, of unanswered questions, of Eleanor's expectations, seemed suddenly lighter. "I need to know if she has the diary," Clint said. "The one from the fire. I need to know if she knows what was in it." The gerente nodded. "Then let's find out." The bookstore was small and crowded with shelves that reached to the ceiling. A bell jingled as they entered, and an elderly man looked up from behind the counter, his glasses perched on the end of his nose. "Can I help you?" he asked. "I'm looking for Rebecca Eastwood," Clint said, the name feeling strange on his tongue. After so many years of not saying it, the man's expression softened. "You must be Clint," he blinked in surprise. "You know who I am. Rebecca has your picture on her desk upstairs. You look just like her." He extended his hand. "I'm Henry, Rebecca's husband. She's not here right now, but she should be back soon. Would you like to wait?" Clint's mind reeled. Husband. Rebecca was married. She had a life here just 2 hours from Carmel by the Sea. All this time she'd been so close. "Yes," Clint said, finding his voice. "Yes, we'll wait." Henry led them up a narrow staircase to an apartment that was the opposite of Eleanor's restaurant in every way, bright, cluttered with books and art, filled with plants that spilled from hanging baskets and crowded the windowsills. It was a space created by someone who embraced life's messiness, who didn't feel the need to preserve everything behind glass. "Make yourselves comfortable," Henry said, gesturing to a worn leather sofa. "I'll put on some tea." As he disappeared into the kitchen, Clint moved slowly around the room, taking in the details of his mother's life. There were photographs everywhere. Rebecca with Henry in front of what looked like the Grand Canyon. Rebecca laughing with a group of women. Rebecca holding a sign at what appeared to be a protest march. But none of Clint, as far as he could. "See?" Then he spotted it, a small silver frame on the desk by the window. Clint walked over, his heart pounding. The photograph was of him at his college graduation, a moment he hadn't known was captured. He was smiling, looking directly at the camera, wearing the cap and gown of his university. Clint picked up the frame, a question forming in his mind. If Rebecca had this picture, it meant she had been there. It meant she had seen him graduate, and hadn't made herself known. The sound of a key in the lock made him turn. The door opened, and there she was, Rebecca Eastwood, 26 years older than when Clint had last seen her, but instantly recognizable. The same dark eyes, the same curved mouth, the same startled expression that Clint sometimes caught in his own reflection. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rebecca broke the silence, her voice exactly as Clint remembered it. "You found me." The cafe was crowded, but they had managed to find a quiet corner table where the din of conversation provided a buffer of privacy. Clint cradled his coffee mug, more for the comfort of holding something warm than for the desire to drink. Across from him, Rebecca seemed equally tense, her fingers tracing the rim of her teacup in an endless nervous circle. They had abandoned Henry's apartment after those first shocking moments of recognition, both of them instinctively seeking neutral ground for the conversation they needed to have. The gerente had tactfully excused himself, promising to return in a few hours, leaving mother and son alone for the first time in 26 years. "I don't know where to start," Rebecca said finally, her voice soft but steady. "There's so much to say, and none of it feels adequate." Clint had rehearsed this moment countless times in his mind, the accusations he would make, the explanations he would demand. But now, faced with the reality of his mother, those practiced speeches dissolved into a single burning question. "Did you know about the fire?" Rebecca's eyes widened in genuine shock. "What fire?" "The restaurant, grandmother's restaurant. It burned down 3 days ago." "Oh my God!" Rebecca pressed a hand to her mouth. "Are you okay? Were you hurt?" The concern in her voice was so immediate, so maternal, that Clint felt a sudden, unwelcome lump in his throat. "I'm fine. Some smoke inhalation, that's all. But the restaurant is gone. Most of what was inside is gone, too." Rebecca nodded slowly, processing. "I heard Eleanor left it to you. Patricia told me—" She stopped, seeming to reconsider her words. "We aren't close, Patricia and I, but we exchange Christmas cards. She mentioned you were living there." "Did you know why?" Clint asked, leaning forward. "Did you know what Eleanor was doing? Forcing me to sort through her things to find the truth piece by piece, like some kind of twisted scavenger hunt." A flash of anger crossed Rebecca's face. "That sounds like Mother. Always in control, even. From beyond the grave. I found the diary, Clint said abruptly. The one from 1979, about you and David, about me. Rebecca went very still, her fingers freezing on the teacup. What did it say? Everything. How David was engaged to Patricia. How Eleanor gave you an ultimatum when she found out you were pregnant. How you chose to leave rather than give me up. Clint paused, watching his mother's expression carefully. At least, that's what it said in the parts I read. I didn't finish. It before the fire. And now it's gone, Rebecca said, her voice hollow. Yes, along with most of the other diaries, along with almost everything else. Clint took a deep breath. Except this. He reached into his bag and pulled out the metal box, setting it on the table between them. Though scorched and dented, it remained sealed, protecting its contents from both fire and water. Rebecca stared at it as if it were a live grenade. Mother's emergency box. You know about it? She showed it to me when I was 10. For when you need to remember who you are, she said, as if I could ever forget. With careful fingers, Clint lifted the lid. The smell of smoke clung to the contents, but they were intact. The letters, the photographs, the jewelry, the birth certificate. He lifted out the last item and placed it in front of Rebecca. Your original birth certificate, with David Mercer, listed as the father. Rebecca touched the document with trembling fingers. I never actually saw this. Mother must have hidden it after I was born. When I got pregnant, she told me she would destroy it, that no one would ever know unless I told them. But she kept it, Clint said. All these years. Yes. Rebecca looked up, her eyes wet with unshed tears. Mother always kept the things that gave her power over others. I think that's why she kept you. The words hung between them, harsh and honest. She used me to punish you, Clint said, the realization dawning with painful clarity, by turning me against you, by making me believe you'd abandoned me because you didn't want me. Rebecca reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching Clint's. I wanted you more than anything. That's why I brought you back to Carmel. I was 22, working 2 jobs, living in a studio apartment with a roommate. You deserved better than what I could give you. And Mother, she promised she would tell you the truth when you were old enough to understand. She never did, Clint said bitterly. She let me believe you were selfish and irresponsible. That's what she called you in the video she left me, right before she finally confessed the truth. Video? Rebecca looked confused. She recorded it a few months before she died. Left it with someone named Margaret Wilson. It was delivered after the fire. Recognition flashed across Rebecca's face. Margaret was Mother's therapist. I didn't know they were still in contact. The revelation that Eleanor, rigid, controlling Eleanor, had sought therapy was startling enough to momentarily distract Clint from his anger. She was seeing a therapist. After you started college. She never told me why, but... Rebecca hesitated. I always wondered if it was because of what happened at your high school graduation. What happened at my graduation? Rebecca's expression softened. I was there, Clint. In the back row. I saw you walk across the stage and I was so proud I thought my heart would burst. Afterward, I waited near your car, that old blue vehicle you bought with your first job money. I was going to introduce myself finally, tell you everything. Clint remembered that day. The stiff suit, the relentless June heat, the crushing disappointment that his mother hadn't bothered to attend. What stopped you? Eleanor saw me first. She intercepted me in the parking lot and said if I approached you, she would tell David everything. She would destroy his marriage, his relationship with his children, with you. She said you were finally happy, finally moving forward with your life, and I would ruin that with my selfish need for closure. So you left, Clint said, the pieces falling into place. Again. I left, Rebecca agreed, her voice breaking, and I've regretted it every day since. The anger Clint had carried for so long, the white-hot rage that had fueled his career, his relationships, his relentless drive to succeed, suddenly felt too heavy to hold. He looked at his mother, really looked at her, and saw not the villain of Eleanor's stories, but a woman who had faced impossible choices and was still living with the consequences. I found you at my college graduation, too. Clint said quietly. I didn't know it was you at the time, but I have the picture, the one on your desk. Someone took it right after the ceremony. Rebecca smiled through her tears. Henry, he came with me. He's been encouraging me to contact you for years, but I was so afraid. Afraid you would hate me. Afraid it was too late. Is it? Clint asked, the question he'd been avoiding since the moment he recognized his mother in the doorway. Is it too late for us? Rebecca reached across the table again, and this time her hand found Clint's, her touch warm and solid and real. Not if you don't want it to be. The tears Clint had been holding back finally spilled over, hot tracks down his cheeks. I don't, he whispered. I don't want it to be too late. Outside the cafe window, fog had begun to roll in, the famous San Francisco fog, floating down in soft grey wisps that melted as they touched the ground. In that moment, watching the fog with his mother's hand in his, Clint felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of the tightly wound grief he had carried for as long as he could remember. The ghosts of the Eastwood family, Iris, Eleanor, Rebecca, Clint himself, seemed to hover in the space between them, their stories intertwined in ways that could never be fully untangled. But for the first time, Clint felt that perhaps they didn't need to be. Perhaps it was enough to acknowledge them, to learn from them, and then to choose a different path forward. There's something else in the box, Clint said, releasing his mother's hand to reach inside. Something I think is meant for you. Withdrew the silver locket, its chain slightly tarnished but the heart-shaped pendant intact. Clint had opened it earlier and found a tiny photograph inside. Rebecca, at 16, her smile carefree, her future still unwritten. Grandmother's locket, Rebecca murmured, taking it from Clint with reverent fingers. She wore it every day when I was growing up. I always wondered what happened to it. She saved it for you, Clint said simply. Whatever else she did, whatever mistakes she made, I think in the end, she wanted to make things right. Rebecca slipped the chain over her head, the locket coming to rest against her sternum. It's too late for Mother and me, she said, her voice steady, but not for you and me. If you'll let me, Clint, I'd like to be in your life again. Not to replace what you've lost, but to build something new. Through the cafe window, Clint could see the gerente waiting patiently on the sidewalk, fog gathering on his shoulders, his expression concerned as he caught Clint's eye. He raised a hand in reassurance, and the gerente nodded, understanding. Without words that he needed more time. I'd like that, Clint said, turning back to his mother. I'd like that very much. 6 months later, Clint stood on a cleared patch of land watching as the last of Eleanor's restaurant was hauled away. The Victorian skeleton had been methodically dismantled, the salvageable materials donated to a housing non-profit in San Francisco. What couldn't be saved had been removed with careful precision, leaving only the granite foundation, a perfect rectangle etched into the hillside like a footprint from another time. Ready? The young garçon asked, handing him the rolled blueprint that had arrived from the architect that morning. Almost, Clint replied, looking past him to where Rebecca and Henry were unloading picnic supplies from their car. Since that foggy afternoon in the cafe, Clint had been slowly rebuilding his relationship with his mother. Weekend visits, long phone calls, careful explorations of a shared history that was finally being told truthfully. He hadn't contacted David or Patricia. That wound was still too raw, the implications too complicated. But he had met with Margaret Wilson, Eleanor's therapist, who had shared what she could about the woman Clint had thought he knew. The pride Eleanor had rarely expressed, the regrets that had driven her to seek help in her final years, the hope that her grandson might someday understand the choices she had made, even if he couldn't forgive them. You don't have to decide everything today, the gerente said, his hand finding Clint's with the easy familiarity that had developed between them over the past months. They were more than friends now, though they were taking things slowly, both aware of the weight of the past and the promise of the future. I know, Clint said, but I think I'm ready to start. The blueprint contained plans for a smaller restaurant, modern, open with large windows facing the town below. A fresh start built on an old foundation. Not so different, Clint thought, from what he was trying to do with his own life. Rebecca approached, carrying a basket that smelled of fresh bread and late summer berries. "Henry's setting up the table by the big oak," she said. "If that works, for everyone." Clint smiled, the expression still sometimes feeling unfamiliar on his face. "It's perfect." As they walked together toward the tree, Clint thought about the ghost stories he had grown up hearing, how spirits remained tethered to places where unfinished business kept them from moving on. The Eastwood family had been haunted for generations, each one passing down their particular ghosts along with their DNA. But ghosts could be released, stories could be rewritten, foundations could be repurposed for structures that let in more light. Clint spread the blueprint on the picnic table, smoothing the edges as Rebecca, Henry, the garçon, and the gerente gathered around. "So," he said, pointing to the central feature of the design, "this is where the dining room will be. A place for new stories, a place for truth, a place where the weight of ghosts could finally be set down, examined in the clear light of day, and then, with care and intention, laid to rest."